it's Elisabeth Hancock, host of the Great Awakening podcast, and I'm really excited to bring back Guy Anderson, author of the book Tesla and the Cabbage Patch Kids. Hi, Guy. Hi, thank you for joining me again.
Thank you for having me on again.
So this week we're going to be looking at Tartarian architecture as being possible descendant from Atlantean architecture, possibly the same type of free energy, the same type of technology that has come down from Atlantis and then went through the different empires and also into the Tartarian Empire, which of course, as we know, took up 90% of the Northern Hemisphere. And actually, you can see this Tartarian architecture everywhere, Japan, China, Australia, Sweden, it's literally everywhere, which we'll come to in a second. So just thinking about Atlantis, 9,600 BC, and then Tartaria 200 years ago, in that large 10,000 year period, what do we think happened in that 10,000 year period in terms of this Atlantean architecture? Is the Tartarian architecture still Atlantean architecture that we see around us that's still being destroyed to this day? Or was it rebuilt in terms of Tartaria? So from your point of view, when did Tartaria, the Empire of Tartaria, begin?
That's a difficult question to answer because we don't know how far back our timeline has been altered. Lots of people claim that the timeline that we currently work to is falsified and that at least 800 to 1,000 years have been added. I think that there's a strong possibility that if they've done it once, they've done it several times before. So it's very difficult to know where our starting point is. But you could argue that the Tartarian Empire or the Tartarian people go right the way back to the biblical times with Magog and Noah's grandchildren. And of course, if you look at, say, for example, King Solomon as being perhaps in the areas of research that I live, really, that King Solomon would be perhaps the most well-known of all Tartarian rulers. So some would argue that he was the first king of Tartaria. And then you're going back, sort of 3,000 years ago-ish, if we go on today being 2025. So you're talking about 3,000 years ago. But I think really that there is a lot of synergy between what people refer to as the millennial reign of Christ, a 1,000-year period of Jesus reigning, and the Tartarian Empire. So I think that really the Tartarian Empire that I talk about, that is discussed on different platforms and in several books out there, is a period really of 1,000 years. That's what I believe, a 1,000 year of peace and living in harmony and in balance with the planet and everything on it.
Okay, so this 1,000 year period of peace, is this the same period as the period of Christ, with the goddess energy embodying the divine feminine, the masculine, the embodiment of which is Jesus? And then this created this period of Christ, which is this peaceful period.
Yeah, I think that they're one and the same thing. Now, I'm not saying for one moment that Jesus lived for 1,000 years, but I think that the ethos, if you like, the structure that he'd put in place, the way of living, that had 1,000 years reign. So I don't think that he actually lived that long, but I do believe that that's the same period of time, that it is what was a period of 1,000 years, and that this was carried on through the people from after Jesus, that this was continued, that other people saw through that period of peace and harmony. And I think perhaps Genghis Khan, just as an example, we've been brought up to believe that he was a warmonger and that he raped and pillaged. And I think that there is a strong possibility that has been inverted and that he was continuing the work that Jesus had started to create an empire of healing and balance and harmony. So everybody was, I suppose, operating on a much higher vibration, a higher frequency, which would be the complete opposite of what we've been taught, because that you would assume that we would have no war, no suffering. So that's what I believe. And that came to an end in 1776, which would have been 976 if people like Anatoly Fomenko are correct. If we take 800 years away, then that 1,000-year reign is not. We're not that far away from it, are we? So, if we say that Jesus was born, I mean, it sounds strange, doesn't it? But if you actually look into when they say that Jesus was born, it was between 4 and 6 BC. So if we put 1,000 years onto that, then we're 20 years off it being 1,000 years, which I think you could argue is close enough, because that the Tartarian Empire still being fully operational, but slowly being eroded and destroyed, and that actually when you got to a few years before the year 1000, which would have been in today's money, if you like, sort of see that would have been perhaps when we started to see direct energy weapons and the severe destruction of fire and flood of the Tartarian Empire and its architecture.
Yes, and I believe still around the Stan countries of around Russia, that there is evidence there of melted looking buildings and towns with the Tartarian architecture that have just been destroyed beyond a normal level of natural decay, which does seem to indicate some sort of weapon or something was used, certainly to melt a building. It would only be looking at energy weapons or solar flashes, but then with that you'd have to have extreme burning as well. So I find that very interesting, that I always think around Russia, Mongolia, these sorts of areas, that when you look more closely at them, the population, the red hair, the tall, the white skin, the light eyes, the typical Slav, and the Slavs, of course, were the original inhabitants of Russia and around that area. And then you're talking about Jesus, Genghis Khan. We know that Genghis Khan had red hair, white skin.
The Mongolian blue spot apparently is supposed to be an indicator that you descend from Genghis Khan. My wife was born with one, and both of my children were. My wife's, her grandparents are, on her father's side, her grandparents are from Madagascar, but she was born with a Mongolian blue spot, and so were my children. And so there's something in that.
I know that in the biblical records, there were so many red-headed people, and we have the Anunnaki are also linked to red hair. Possibly not the actual Anunnaki themselves, but possibly what they created. So if they created Adam, his sons, then one of those redhead, which then sort of led to a red hair line, which I think is sort of what's indicated in the Bible. And I've always been fascinated by this red hair, and we're now down to 1% of the population has red hair. It's always fascinated me, where have all the redheads gone? And I think Jesus was supposed to be redhead, wasn't he?
Yeah, the European Jews say that Jesus had red hair and blue eyes. They say apparently King David and King Solomon also had red hair. So that there's something there. There is a gene being passed down, isn't there? Clearly.
Yeah. And I think the fact that there's so few redheads now, I think it seems to make sense that then the redheads took up a large percentage of this Tartarian civilization. So if King Solomon was the first king 3,000 years ago, that means the Tartarian Empire was around for 3,000 years. So possibly the Tartarian Empire was an offshoot of one of these sons of Adam, and they were creating a positive, peaceful civilization. We can see this with the architecture. It's a healing type of architecture with the organs, the pipes, the sacred geometry, the different types of pulling in energy from the ether. Whichever way you look at it, they're using natural resources, energy sources to heal their bodies in many different ways, which also makes me think of why did they need to heal their bodies continuously in that way in such a peaceful time? And I don't know whether you have any thoughts on that. What were they healing from? What was the rest of the world looking like at that time?
That's a good question. I think that they understood cymatics. If you could imagine or picture the world before we started building things, then everything was balanced. A tree would only grow somewhere where it was possible to grow, and obviously you don't have grass on the top of a rocky mountain, and so on and so forth. So I think what they tried to do when they were building something, putting a structure in place, they understood and appreciated that to do that, they were upsetting the environment, and it would have some sort of effect ecologically on the surrounding area. So if you go and stick, for example, a housing estate in the middle of a forest, you're going to cause some sort of damage ecologically to the wildlife and to the forest. So I think by building in harmony and using cymatics and frequency, that not only would they ensure that they lived in as close to a natural world as possible. So I guess by being within the walls of a building or a star fort or a city that was resonating at the same frequency as trees and plants and Mother Nature itself, that they were as close to living in nature as possible. So I think it was also to do with that. If you got to live due to how we live today, and I suppose you could argue have to live today, that if you're going to live in a artificial environment, something that is man-made and not natural, then to at least get it to vibrate and operate on the same frequency as it would do if you were living in amongst the forest or a woodland. And they achieved that with these star forts and with the cities that they built the World's Fairs in, or that the World's Fairs were put into. Star forts is probably the best example of that. So I guess you're working with the planet and with the earth.
Because the ley lines, the yin lines, the yang lines, they make a massive difference to our health.
Yeah, and of course all churches are built where ley lines cross. Typically a church will be built where two ley lines cross. So they had a better understanding than we do. Or you could argue that they worked for the betterment of each other and the planet, whereas now the powers that be don't do that. They don't want us to be balanced and to be healthy and well. They don't want our minds to be pure and unclouded and have clarity. They want us to be in a lower vibrational state. That the care has gone. The people that ultimately make the decisions on everything really don't care about us at all. In fact, quite the opposite. They'd rather we weren't here. So I think that it's a very different way of living. And you can see that just by when you look around you and look at a new housing development, how soulless it is, or a block of flats, the lack of passion that went into any of its design or thought. So I think that I think the ethos with the Tartarians was, and certainly people from that period, was if you're going to build something, then it needs to be in balance and harmony with the environment and the planet. So we'll build it on ley lines, we'll have it resonate in the right frequency, because if you can't literally go out and hug a tree today or ground yourself on the grass, then at least you are still getting the same vibration. You're being constantly subjected to the correct frequency as if you were out there within Mother Nature.
We're creating our own reality. So when we are in low vibrations, we're creating a world that we don't want to live in. When we're in the higher vibrations, we're creating a very beautiful, harmonious, peaceful, positive world.
Yeah. And if you can get everybody in your community or everybody in your area to be operating at that same frequency, then everyone benefits from that. And we've all felt the feeling when you walk into a room and there's somebody that you just know perhaps isn't a particularly nice person, and you can feel it. You can feel the energy, or someone's not in a very good mood, or someone's upset or angry about something, and you can feel it, and it has an effect on everybody else around them. And it might be somebody's angry about something, or someone's just an unpleasant person for whatever reason, and you spend time with them and you find that it lowers your frequency, that you become low as well. And who would want that? I think only the parasites that saw the end to all of this would benefit and enjoy living like that, or certainly watching others live like that. And that the Tartarians and the people before that lived in peace and harmony, you can understand why they wanted everyone's vibration to be high, because really what sort of person would want to surround themselves? Or let's take, for example, if, for example, the royal family and the government truly run everything that happens in the UK, why would they want to have a country or be responsible for so many people that are unhappy, that are angry, that are fighting about various things? Why would anybody want that unless they are a low vibration or very negatively charged person themselves? They wouldn't want it. And clearly what happens here is the parasites that are in charge of everything, at least for now, they feed off of this low vibration. They feed off it. So they're parasites in every way, shape and form. They not only survive by other people going to work and providing them with an income, but they actually feed off our energy too. And I think that perhaps one of the worst things that could happen to you would be to be incarcerated, to be locked away from society. And I often think it's interesting that the process of sending someone to prison is an interesting one, because they are charged and then they're placed in a cell. And I think that if you ever wanted what's going on there really to be hidden in plain sight, then that's a good explanation for it, because they are going to take your life's energy from you by putting you in a cell. But before they do that, they charge you just like a battery. And a lot of the older prisons around the world are red and white brick. Rows of red bricks, the occasional row of white brick, and then back to red. And that denoted a power supply, a power station, a source of power, of energy. And I find it fascinating by turning those into prisons, charging someone and putting them inside a cell. And also you've got this military reference to a battery, where you've got a group of soldiers referred to as a battery, or a defence, or a fortress of some description being referred to as a battery. And I think it is the energy, and I think that is where the parasites get a lot of pleasure from, locking people up sometimes for things that don't really warrant it. And perhaps going back even further, if you look at why you could be locked away a couple of 100 years ago, be it a prison or a lunatic asylum, that the reasons that you would be incarcerated were very flimsy, and certainly today wouldn't stand or hold any water. So I think that there has been this whole thing with keeping everybody's vibration as low as possible, and these people are feeding from that. They actually get their energy from us, and that is the best way to take it. So it's in total contrast. You imagine the feeling of euphoria you would have if you lived inside a star fort compared to a high-rise block of flats today. It's a polar opposite, and I think that there is some sort of level of enjoyment or benefit from making us live like that.
Although we don't know what the Atlantean buildings civilization looked like, we can probably assume that they were using the same type of free energy. If you look at the pyramids like a sort of a battery, and then you've got the quartz, the water, this type of energy that could be involved. Also, the fact that the resonance inside the pyramid is very different to outside as well. There seems to be something to do with the limestone, the capstone at the top, which was possibly metal of some sort, again, pulling in the energy from the ether. If we imagine that the pyramids possibly go back even 100,000 years ago, we can see that free energy was being used in our world thousands and thousands of years ago. So we can assume that the Tartarians were continuing the use of this energy. And we can probably assume that Atlantis was using the same type of energy, which means that they possibly had similar types of buildings, because the buildings themselves were able to pull in the ether and convert this into energy. So maybe you can explain how this works.
Yeah, so I think like you said, that this technology is clearly what the pyramids were. One of the reasons the pyramids were constructed. I think they served lots of purposes. Obviously, we were taught that. Well, I remember as a child being told that that's where the pharaohs were buried. The pharaohs were inside the pyramids, but of course, that we now know that's not the case. So I believe that the pyramids were power stations, and they were harnessing energy from the ether. So using the electromagnetic energy that exists purely because of the poles, the magnetic force of the North and South poles, to harness in on that and to capture it and store it. So what the Tartarians were doing, it appears that they were using Atlantean technology. And of course, if the pyramids are the sort of age that you and I believe they are, and a lot of people now believe they are, I think it's fair to say that they're a lot older than we've been told. Far much older than we've been told. And perhaps if we just took the Great Pyramid of Giza just as an example, if we could suggest that perhaps that is one of the oldest structures that exists or has survived, and that was built to store and generate power. Of course, then the other conversation that would spin off from that is, what were they powering? What did they need electricity for? But there are hieroglyphs of things that look very similar to light bulbs. So,
And
I think
planes,
what yeah,
helicopters.
absolutely, planes and helicopters, all sorts of things. And I think the Tartarian technology is just a modernized version of that, where over the time things are simplified, and perhaps Atlantis is where they got the technology from. A lot of people say that the Tartarians used Atlantean technology. Whether the building techniques were the same, we don't know, because we can only theorize what Atlantis actually looked like. And as we spoke earlier on, that if you go through the dialogues of Plato, it's so second, third-hand information now, isn't it? We don't really know, and these descriptions are obviously so old now that we don't know exactly. I mean, when Plato died sort of nearly 2,500 years ago, so lots of things that obviously can be lost in translation. So we can only really theorize what Atlantis truly looked like, but we do know that they appear to be technologically advanced, and that appears to have been shared and used by the Tartarian people. But of course, rather than building a pyramid with a gold or a quartz or crystal coating or covering or capstone, they were using, more often than not, metal, and copper in particular. So you would have what looked like a weather vane or a flag mast or pole that would pick up the electromagnetic energy just from our atmosphere, and that was then put inside a capacitor. In some of the larger buildings that were really for generating power, that you would obviously be able to tell from some distance that you were approaching one of these buildings, or you knew what this building was, because they would have a copper dome. And of course, most of them now are green, but in some parts of the world, they still have the bright, shiny copper dome still present. And I wonder with those if they're still working, if they're still operational. I've been told by several people that the discoloration, the copperizing, where they become green, wasn't just necessarily due to weathering and age, but actually after the reset of 1776, horse urine was coated over quite a number of these buildings to stop them from working, to tarnish them faster. It sped up the tarnishing of these copper domes. And the energy that went into these buildings was stored in coils, copper coils, within a mercury tank. And it was red mercury that was being used in particular, which is quite hard to get hold of now, that is. And then that would operate and power your home, whether it's heating or anything else. But also there's a lot of evidence to suggest that that is how that they were powering vehicles, that streets had underground metal gridworks, and that electric vehicles and electric trams were receiving, in a very similar way to a bumper car. I don't know if there's another word for a bumper, dodgems. In exactly the same way they operate is how vehicles and trams were operating too. So Atlantean technology, and this of course is what Tesla apparently spent his life trying to reverse engineer, trying to get the world back on, to supply everywhere in the world with free energy, which I don't think people like JP Morgan particularly wanted to see happen.
Yeah. So one of the reasons that the Tartarian Empire was deleted is because they wanted to start charging people for everything, and it was money driven.
Yeah, I think that they get to a certain period of time where, and I do believe that this is already predetermined, that this is all mapped out and planned a long time in advance. They said that, as I mentioned before, that the period of 1,000 years that we refer to as the Tartarian Empire is also referred to as the Empire of Free Energy, the Empire of Free Travel. But quite often I'm corrected and told that this period of 1,000 years that I'm talking about, not where the Tartarians came from or the very start of the Tartarian civilization, but a period of time when they were at their peak, where they were constructing all of these amazing buildings and these white cities, like the ones used to hold the world's fairs, and cathedrals and churches and crystal palaces and so on, and Star Force. A period of 1,000 years when they achieved that. actually, I'm often corrected and told that I am referring to the 1,000-year reign of Jesus, the millennial reign of Christ, and that this was already preset, that after the 1,000-year reign, there would be a period of 250 years for Satan's reign of terror, and that the parasites that descend all the way back to the Anunnaki, people like Marduk, who otherwise known as Amun Ra, that they would then have this period of time to get out there for 250 years and just wreak havoc and destroy everything. And then when that 250-year reign is up, which coincidentally would expire when Agenda 2030. So Agenda 2030, that would fit perfectly in with this 250-year reign of terror, Satan's little season. And then my hope is, and the hope of, I know that the hope of yourself and lots of people that I speak to, is that after that, we start again and we rebuild what the Tartarians, the Atlanteans, what they had, and we go back to that and we slowly reintroduce the free energy and we raise the frequency and the vibration. So a lot of people would argue that this reset that we're going through is actually going to be a positive one. And it isn't going to be this gloom and doom, and that the people like the World Economic Forum have now got a very short period of time to implement as much damage as they can before it's our turn again.
But who gave them 250 years of, Satan's chaos? Who gave them that? And why? What is the point of that? I mean, it's just insane, isn't it?
Apparently so. And they use it as a purge. So they can say that the planet's overpopulated, that we've got global warming issues, and obviously none of this, we know none of this is true. Yeah, it's all nonsense, and it's the people with real power that are causing the damage. You can't compare what we do. So, I mean, for example, Mr. Gates justifies flying around everywhere on a private jet by saying that he pays the tax for doing that. But what he's not doing is reducing his carbon footprint. He's saying that he's paying by doing that he's putting money in to cover the damage that he's causing. But money doesn't cover the damage, does it? Yeah, I just think that we're convinced, they try to convince us that everything we do or the way that we live has had an impact on the planet, when actually it's the people that are in control that are causing all of the damage on the planet. And if for example, flying around everywhere is going to cause a significant effect to the environment, then they would stop it immediately. Paying someone pounds to go into an area with a car that has high emissions does not stop the emissions. It just means someone somewhere else now has £10 of your money. You're being able to pay to continue to pollute.
Let's go back to the Tartaria and Atlantis link again, because I think this is very interesting, because although we don't know what Atlantis looked like, there have been now 20,000 books written on Atlantis. So that is a lot of people writing about this. A lot of people feel called to write about Atlantis. And you have to ask yourself, why is that? Are these epigenetic memories coming to the surface? I think so. I've done a lot of hypnosis sessions with people. I've had many clients talking about Atlantis. They describe what the architecture looks like. They describe what the streets, the environment looks like. It seems to sound very much like this Tartarian architecture, with the same Tartarian architecture that we see that makes up a large part of St. Petersburg still. I think that this is a true representation of what the original Tartarian civilization empires look like. And, I can imagine that this could have been what Atlantis looked like as well, which also makes us think, did Atlantis then not sink? Maybe the continent of Atlantis sank, but the rest of Atlantis, which was actually covering the entire planet, was still there. And is this architecture that we have, the Tartarian architecture, could this actually still be the Atlantean architecture, or has it been destroyed and rebuilt again? What are your thoughts on this?
It's a difficult question to answer, because if we're working with the timelines that we know, that we've grown up with, then we're talking about 9,600 BC as being when Atlantis fell. These buildings are the buildings that we know and are clearly not that old, are they? But if the timeline has been altered numerous times, civilization as we know it could just be 1,000 years old, give or take, and that 9,600 BC could literally be 1,400 years ago. Or 1,600 years ago. It might not be as long as we've been told. So I guess it all depends on what would be, I suppose, the best. Yeah, to know what time frame we're working on, and if we really truly knew what the year was now, I've wiped 800 years off our timeline. I believe that when the reset happened and the introduction of New World Order in 1776, that they had added 800 years, making the year 976. So obviously now the year would be, in theory, 1225 if 800 years have been added to our timeline. So we don't, but what we don't know, and you mentioned something earlier on about with the Russians having 5,500 years wiped off or disappeared. We don't know what we're working with, do we? We don't know how long ago these periods of time are. They say that the Anunnaki arrived 450 odd thousand years ago. But where did we get that date from? And do we know that that's correct? How old is the planet? I was just going to say that the pyramids, it's claimed that they're a great deal older than they actually are. And some people say that they're a lot more recent. And we're all coming from it at different angles. So I think really, if we work on the year as we believe it to be, as the narrative tells us to be, then the Tartarian structures that are out there now, and let's say, for example, in the UK, St Paul's Cathedral is something that looks typically Tartarian to me. Now that's obviously not going to be 10,000 odd years old, but of course the building that's underneath it may well be.
Yeah, so I heard recently that Stonehenge, the original Stonehenge, is actually underneath what we see, which is very interesting. And we know that churches, the Roman churches, are built on top of pagan sites, which then I think brings us nicely onto Avalon. So Avalon, King Arthur, the time of Avalon, this, I know you've talked about this in a previous podcast, that the concept of Avalon also being the Tartarian Empire, and it's the time of King Arthur, Merlin. We have a lot of myths and legends around these things in Great Britain, and especially the Celts, the Welsh, the Scottish. These are very much sort of engrossed in this sort of King Arthur time period, this Avalon. So Avalon is the mythical island, which could also be Atlantis. And it's talked about in terms of, there was a lot of advanced technology, what we would call supernatural, but I think it's advanced technology that they were using at that time, seeming again to indicate that they were using this Tartarian technology, but they were using even more different types of technologies as well. And, what are your thoughts on this? So in terms of Avalon being part of the Tartarian Empire, that these were actual real people that lived, real kings that lived, and have just again been wiped out of our history books like so many, because it doesn't fit the history that they want to create as, as our history.
I don't know, to be totally honest. I don't think it's likely personally that the Isle of Avalon is, the Isle of Avalon today we would know as Glastonbury, but I don't believe that is Atlantis. But that isn't to say that it's not Atlantean. The interesting thing, as I said to you earlier on, that you've got this sort of reoccurring story. If you look at King Arthur and the legend of King Arthur, and then you look at Luke Skywalker and Harry Potter, the story's very similar. And I wonder if that is because people want to get the message out there that how King Arthur lived, because it's a slightly older story now that they've modernised it. They modernised it for me during my childhood with Luke Skywalker. He's got the lightsaber instead of the sword, and now Harry Potter's got the wand. And of course, they say in Harry Potter that the wand chose the person, not the other way around, which is very much what happened to King Arthur and Excalibur. So, are we just being repeated over and over the story of King Arthur? But where does that come from? The fight of good and evil, or good over evil. So I don't know. I really don't know either way. Did he exist or not? But the more I look into Tartaria and the more research I've done generally around things connected to it, the more I've started to believe that mythology isn't mythology at all. Things that we aren't supposed to know about are dismissed as myth because they don't want us understanding what they call occult history or occult knowledge, which of course just means hidden, and that they don't want us to understand that. So the things surrounding King Arthur, let's just say removing the sword from the stone, and Merlin, for example, they don't want us understanding that any of this is possible. So it's dismissed as myth, and then we shrug it off and say, well, it never happened, it wasn't real. And the more I'm subjected to being told something is a myth, the more I'm starting to think that it isn't at all, and it's just misdirection. To dismiss something's a lot easier sometimes than to actually believe it. So I think that that's perhaps going on with King Arthur. And King Arthur, because, as I said a second ago, King Arthur, the legend of King Arthur had been around for a very, very long time, and I think they just modernise it. They modernise the story to continue to get the message out there.
I know that the Jesus story can be traced back to Mithras. So why do they keep getting this story out? What benefit is for them?
There's a couple of ways of looking at that. I think one is that the story is referred to in terms of writing. If you're writing a book, that it's the hero's journey. And that's how they refer to the story of Jesus, Harry Potter, or any of these people. That is a best-selling formula on how to write a book. But of course, you could also argue that the reason that they keep getting this message out there is because there are people that want people to grow up understanding that good wins in the end, that it's okay to be a little bit different, that there is divine intervention, and so on. So, having grown up with Luke Skywalker, I was told or I suppose I'm watching the screen and I'm being told all about the Force, this sort of energy of good that we can draw power from at times in times of need, that's all around us, and that even in the end, good will always win. Well, that's the same with Harry Potter. What I find interesting is that the main characters of these things always appear to be an orphan, as King Arthur was himself. So they're born fatherless, or they are orphans. It's the same recurring story all the time. So my interest with King Arthur, Jesus, Harry Potter, Luke Skywalker, isn't perhaps that it's the same story, just adapted and modernised constantly. My interest is, why are these people always either orphans or born without a father? What does that suggest? Why is that? And is that because something somewhere has intervened, and that this person has been altered slightly or put here by something else to make it different?
Yeah, so the amount of people whose the father was the Lord, they didn't have a father. It was the Lord God. I mean, we sort of know that as Yahweh, which possibly was one of the Anunnaki, which makes them an extraterrestrial of some sort. We've also got as well the concept of the dropped off babies. This has been going on for centuries, that babies have been dropped off here from other planets. And in order to help essentially to raise the levels of consciousness of humans by bringing higher dimensional beings here. But, you know, the concept of the virgin birth is sort of like the father is the higher dimensional being that's incarnating through the vessel of the woman. I mean, I find that interesting, but I do think that we've had more than one bloodline. We haven't just had Anunnaki and Homo sapiens. I suspect that there's many other bloodlines and DNA in there as well, which I know we're going to talk about in a next episode. But King Arthur in that same time period, this could be one of the kings that was then killed off at that time. And interestingly, the different types of technology they had as well. So we have Excalibur with the sword in the stone, as you said. And we also have the Lady of the Lake. And there are so many references to underwater cities, underwater beings helping humanity. So again, this seems to be another helping hand from someone.
I think of something that interests me more so recently is Ukraine. That there seems to be a lot there. As I was saying to you earlier on, that Plato proposed in the dialogues of Plato that Atlantis was located in the Sea of Azov, which is off the top shores of Ukraine and Russia. I've been told by numerous people, and certainly a lot of things that I've watched and read over the recent years, suggest that Jesus was buried in Ukraine, and that Genghis Khan, the Mongolian Empire, if you want to refer to it as the Mongolian Empire, as we've been taught by the mainstream narrative, then one of the things you'll often see written, a sort of Wikipedia or Google quote, if you like, one of the first lines you'll see is that the Mongol Empire stretched from Korea to Ukraine. Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. I keep seeing Ukraine, and that there's something there. And you know, if Plato was right, that was where it was located off the shore of Ukraine, and if people that say Jesus died in Ukraine and was buried in Ukraine are right, and obviously the Mongolian Empire specifically stretched to Ukraine, there's something going on there, and that makes me wonder if that has some element of the reason that it's been bombed, or the reason for declaring war. It's always been in the middle of an issue, Ukraine, hasn't it? Even when it was Crimea, the Crimean War. They've been trying to get to this place for a very, very long time. So I wonder if Ukraine has some sort of remnant of Atlantis, and that actually is the place that we should all be focusing on. If you look at what happened just in the weeks leading up to the invasion of Iraq, the tomb of Gilgamesh had apparently been uncovered. And what do when they first airstrike Iraq? They bombed the site of where they say that they found this tomb. It was one of the first things that they hit. So now with regard to Tartaria, Atlantis, Jesus, Genghis Khan, I'm very much focused on Ukraine. There's something there, so maybe we should have a look into that and do something on that.
It's frustrating that we have to do all this research. Why can't someone just tell us?
Someone knows, don't they? Somebody somewhere knows, or a group of people know. But perhaps when this Satan's season's over, this 250-year period is up, maybe that is when we will find out. Maybe the truth will come out. I hope it is, but I think with most things, as we were speaking before we started recording, that I think when you come out with something that's profound, even if it's true, that it can really blow people's minds. And I think that if we suddenly came out on the news today and said, well, it's been decided today by I don't know, the World Economic Forum or the Vatican or whoever, or all the governments that signed the Antarctic Treaty, which is a very strange one, that they've all decided now that they want to set the record straight, and there's been a lot of falsification with our history and our timeline. And the 1st of January this year was actually going to be the 1st of January, I don't know, 1225 or 8025, and set the record straight. That would blow people's minds. And I don't think if the average person who doesn't look into these sort of things, it could have a detrimental effect on them. They could think, well, if they lied about that, they lied about everything else. Sod it. Who cares if I go out and kill someone? Who cares if I do this? It doesn't matter if I do that. Nothing matters anymore. And I guess that's the fear, isn't it? That if you overwhelm someone with something, that it could have a massive knock-on effect. But having said that, it's got to come out. So maybe there are a series of events that are taking place right now through just for argument's sake, perhaps a recent medical intervention is designed to take out certain people from society who aren't ready to hear the truth, or will not be able to rise to a higher vibration, or won't be able to adapt. The people that at the end of the Tartarian Empire were locked away, the people that were incarcerated and considered insane because they would not work with how things were going to be in this new world. Maybe that's what we're going through now. Maybe that is part of the reset. I don't know. And that's the problem, isn't it? We're trying to find out all this information and get to the truth. It's held by people who are doing their damnedest to make sure we don't find out. So it's a tough task.
I think that there are white hats, that are helping to push more positive or more useful information out there. I do feel this. And that's why I think that, it's being drip fed out to us. And, things like, for example, the millions of scrolls that they have in Tibet, in the monasteries there. I understand that these are starting to now be translated. They'll start to come out. The artifacts of the Vatican, the religious texts in the Vatican as well, these are starting to come out. So I think this is going to bring out a huge amount of information onto the market. The problem that we have at the moment is there's so much misinformation to counteract that.
Because we're ready. And the information, as you say, the information's out there.
But another piece of information that I discovered recently, I was reading it today actually, was so incredible. Because the energy that they were using to power their society, it was powering all sorts. I mean, as you know, it was also powering their lights, but they also apparently had electromagnetic swords, which looked like the Jedi swords from people used to actually use these. They had all sorts of amazing technologies, didn't they? It was just incredible.
Yeah. And also, and I put a little bit about this in my book, but not too much. But also that they knew how to harness energy from salt water, and so ships were actually sailing using energy generated through the sea itself. So they weren't just one-trick ponies. It wasn't just the ether that they were harnessing energy from. It was the entire planet, every aspect of it. So some people have told me that from some information I've got, that the energy that they were able to create from the salt water was only enough to power the electricity, the lighting, and so on board a ship. And some people say no, that the entire ship was powered through salt water. They had worked out how to get everything from the planet, how to work with the planet. Whereas I guess today we work against it. Drilling for oil and mining and for coal, which we've done for some time now, which never needed to happen. We never needed to disrupt anything. The energy's always been here. But I guess that, there are people that have an awful lot of power and influence that are going to stop things, or have stopped things like that being available for public consumption. And as you said, it does look like there's a good possibility that these things are going to change, that very soon it's going to be overturned and we'll go back to that. But if you look into scientists and doctors and researchers that over the last sort of 20, 30 years that have come up with inventions working on free energy, they've all come to a suspicious demise. They've been poisoned or found dead somewhere, and the deep state doesn't want us having this form of technology. But hopefully that's all going to change.
Really gives me so much hope, because it shows that humans haven't changed. We're still those Tartarian people, because we're such amazing creators. We create stuff all the time. It's how we're made. And you can see the Tartarians this is what they were like. They were creating this stuff all the time. And we are still like this. So we are the Tartarians. We are the descendants of them.
Yeah, could well be. We've got to look at their essence. Where they got the information from, that's an interesting one, because that could either have been passed on, or it could be information that is actually brought to them by something or someone else. And with regards to Nikola Tesla, some people say that he was able to communicate with alien entities, or a higher level of consciousness, a higher level of being, and that is where he was getting the information from. There was also an obsession during the Second World War with the German Chancellor and the occult and getting information that way. So I wonder if these people are actually looking to get information through the ways we've been told are wrong. So by looking into the occult or trying to communicate, I suppose a very weak way of comparing it would be a Ouija board, wouldn't it? Where we're trying to communicate with a completely different entity to us and get answers to questions.
Yeah,
So
channeling.
yeah. And is that what they're trying to do? Is that what we've always done? Freddie Silver and several people have said that that is what used to happen in the pyramids, in the king's chamber, that you could actually communicate with other beings while you were inside that chamber. I think you had to do a certain thing. It might have even been take a particular drink or a drug or some kind of hallucinogenic or something, but you could then communicate. And I think that's something that we've always available to us.
In fact, this goes back 400,000 years. So 400,000 years ago, our ancestors were using plant medicine to connect to whatever, which I find interesting as well, because that obviously is a time period when we're told that the Anunnaki were already here. Or if they weren't here then, how would Neanderthal man or whatever know even to do something like this? Where would this knowledge have come from? Interestingly, these areas around the world where plant medicine was being used, they showed significant jumps in levels of consciousness. And being an active channeler of information myself, I can say or attest that it does like expand your levels of consciousness. It does. So were they channeling this information or were they being given this information? There is a book I'm reading at the moment called Serpents and Dragons. He refers to the many different reptilian statues which were found in the Ubaid population 20,000 years ago. He talks about these statues actually being types of transmitters. And so people were using them to transmit to motherships up above. Just thinking of the cosmic link again. So I discovered that Arthur in Latin actually is Arcturus. And of course, Arcturus is the brightest star in the constellation of the Bootes.
Oh.
Arthur also means noble, brave, and strong in Hebrew. So it doesn't have to actually be in a King Arthur at all. It could just be that we're talking about leaders, commanders, leaders, kings, warlords, these sorts of things. Yeah. Okay. So, well, I think I'll bring it to a close there. I think we've covered a lot of very, very interesting areas. Is there anything that you would like to end with? Of course, tell people about your book, how they can contact you, these sorts of things.
One thing I would say is sometimes I wonder if people would benefit from the conversations we have before you hit record, because I know they're all over the place, but we do discuss some fascinating subjects. So maybe we should do that one day, just you and I rambling. People might find that fascinating. I'm sure they don't want to know about the life and the life and times of a writer or a researcher, but some of the things that we touch upon, where you just suddenly go off at a tangent and just want to share some information. I wonder if people would find that interesting. But if anyone wants to get in touch with me, my email, by all means, email me. I do reply to everything. It takes me a while, but they can email me if you put it in the description. Then by all means get in touch. Anything they want to share. The book I'm working on at the moment is very much around human cloning. So if anybody wants to share any information, and what I tend to do is I did with my previous book. If anyone contributed anything that I could use, then I do credit them with it. So that their name's in the back of the book, and if it's something of big enough to, if we're talking a few paragraphs or a few pages of information, then obviously, I'll say that it's them. And what I'm going to be doing is putting a photo, if they're happy with it, is putting a photo of them within the book and saying that this information was from this person. So anything to do with human cloning, be it from Anunnaki to the Cabbage Patch babies, then get in touch, and if I can use it, then I'll credit you with it.
Okay, that's great. Yeah. So your next book, what's that called?
Rise of the Clones, the Cabbage Patch Babies.
Okay. Okay. Fantastic. Okay. So yeah. So anyone know anything about cloning, then reach out to Guy and let him know. But yes, we were talking about some very interesting things earlier, weren't we, around cloning? But I'll leave that for another episode. Okay. All right. Well, take care. Thanks very much.
Thank you for having me. Bye bye.